Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar or masterclass, actually, on impact measurement at the intersection of complexity and capital. I'm Karim Harji. This webinar is being hosted on behalf of the Oxford Impact Measurement Program. Many of you have attended some of our previous webinars around these topics of how is impact measurement changing, what are the tools and approaches that we're using, and these are meant to give you, this session in particular, as a masterclass, is meant to give you a bit of a sneak peek into how we teach at Oxford and how we address some of these issues, particularly at the intersection of research, practice, and looking ahead at what's next around where impact measurement is and where it's going. So I'll introduce briefly the speakers that we have today, all of whom are guest faculty in the Oxford Impact Measurement Program. If you are interested, I'll share some more information in the next slide, as well as at the end around how you can get in touch to learn more about the program. And we have a great lineup of guest faculty and speakers who join us every year. Emily, Matt, and Julia have been working on impact measurement in different ways for a long time, and we're so lucky to have them as part of our core faculty on the program. You'll hear more about their perspectives, both from their work with particular organizations, but also around field building. And over the past few years, as we've introduced more around the ideas of complexity, systems thinking, and looking at not only where measurement is today, but where it's going, we've been comparing notes, we've been probing, we've been thinking about, how do we bring coherence and clarity to some of these issues, which, judging by the number of people on this webinar, there's a lot of interest. We wanted to make it accessible, both in terms of how we're packaging and understanding and seeing some of these issues play out in practice, but also to give some space to you to ask us some questions around what you're seeing in your spaces and what may be next. Just housekeeping wise, this will be recorded, it'll be shared with all of you, and let us know what kinds of questions you have. Share any links or resources also in the chat. And we have a Q&A function if you'd like to ask us some questions. We'll have time for that towards the last part of the webinar as well. And so brief introductions. I'm the program director of the Oxford Impact Measurement Program. I'm also a practitioner and researcher in this area. Emily Goodall is here in one of her roles as a board member with the Access Foundation, but also teaches with me some of the modules on systems thinking for impact measurement in the program. Matt Ripley is the director at Impact Frontiers, where he's leading the impact performance reporting norms. He'll tell us a little bit more about that. And he also teaches with me, and we're leading some other work through the Innovative Finance Initiative around how do you report on systemic impacts, which we will provide some information around. Julia Mensing's the director of impact at Acumen. In the program, we use a critical framework to talk about the ways in which we can confront the issues around impact measurement. So we usually start with questions of why we measure, to what we measure, to how we measure, and look at the implications. Why this is interesting is when you bring the context of multiple forms of capital, of complexity, of system perspectives, some of the ways that we've conventionally answered these questions might change. And in fact, some of these questions might change. So that's what we're going to talk about later during this session. And so let me set up quickly why it's important to have this discussion now. Because we see across the range of ways in which we are making investments, everything from philanthropy to impact investing to innovative finance, there's both a shift in the type of ambition and the type of approaches that are being used. Increasingly, you see the language of systems or of multi-capital approaches or polycapital approaches being used. Investors are increasingly saying that they don't only want to conduct transactions or kind of narrow sector-focused strategies, but often are multi-asset class, multi-sector, and multi-region. And that extends to also thinking about things like not just direct corporate or venture impact or products or services, but then thinking about markets and incentives and the ways in which we're trying to shift structures, operating norms, and the default kind of positioning around what impact looks like as well. All of this creates a new set of challenges at this intersection of multiple forms of capital and different types of complexity. Here are just a number of different ways in which that is beginning to shift. So we look at this idea of maybe discrete or targeted interventions to something that's much more distributed. Maybe you're testing a new set of products or services across multiple regions all at the same time. Maybe you're thinking about how to intervene at different points in a system to really identify how you shift the default behaviors around what's preventing, let's say, access to quality healthcare or quality education, rather than just having one narrow or programmatic focus. In this way, then you're really shifting the way in which you think about what the boundaries of your influence and your measurement might need to look like. And all of a sudden, you are interfacing with other actors. You are engaging perhaps in different types of systems, different kinds of organizations. And it's not very easy to define the boundaries around which you may also look at your measurement, your KPIs, and your reporting. And once you acknowledge that as part of a systems or complexity informed approach, you are one actor amongst many. You are trying to understand your relationship and your contribution. All of a sudden, this raises very different challenges methodologically around how you can measure impact, how much credit you take, and what is the way in which you use those results to inform your future work. So these raise both a set of challenges and questions, but also a set of opportunities. And one of the things that we have heard, and all of us are working on, frankly, is if you acknowledge all of this, how do you still do your daily work? What are the ways in which you can actually still advance, recognizing that we don't have all the answers, but in fact, we do have a lot of good starting points. And so, just as a setup to what we're going to talk about today, we know that as we're moving towards more complexity-informed or system-oriented practices, we know investors and others are rethinking not just what we measure, that might be obvious, but also what are we actually seeking? What's the kind of ambition we have or should have or could have? How do we think about indicators, evidence, KPIs? For some of you, that's your favorite topic, and where we know we have a lot of questions, so we'll talk about that. And then on the question of impact reporting and communication, how do we describe performance in this kind of context? And then internally, as you reflect on your organizations, what skills and capabilities do you need to do this well? So each of us are going to take a stab at that in order, and then we'll turn it over to you and try and respond to some of your questions, as well as how you might be seeing these issues play out in your work. So I'm going to start very quickly before I turn it over to Emily. I've covered some of this already, but just to provide a bit more color, we're seeing these changes occur across the range of investors that are involved. Everything from foundations using market-based tools to the range of impact investors, both asset owners and asset managers. There are now multiple platforms and intermediaries that are also increasingly recognizing that they need to be perhaps more expansive, more ambitious, and step out of the single theme, single tool box. That then changes the way you talk about what you do, not just an outcome for a specific population. There's nothing wrong with that, obviously. Sometimes you do need to be very specific and targeted. But if you are acknowledging that the relationship between how your capital flows, how you show up, and how you're trying to indirectly or directly influence the market and the system you're in, all of a sudden you are measuring different things, you're bringing different inputs to the table, and you have different expectations around what that might look like. Sometimes that is expanding the way in which you or others show up in how you're trying to address a pressing social environmental issue. It could be through the use of technologies, the kinds of capital you're bringing, and the non-financial capital that you bring. Sometimes you're not only investing directly in ventures or enterprises, you're investing in intermediaries. Now, it could be funds, it could be platforms, it could be something else. And trying to assess impact in those indirect intermediaries in a way is a very different proposition than looking at direct impact. Sometimes when you're using your capital to signal to other investors or to begin to shift default expectations and norms, you can't really measure just at a point in time. You're often thinking about framing, narratives, and how those shifts change over time and what's behind them. Is it shifting default behaviors? Is it shifting expectations? Is it really trying to think about how you might influence policy or the kind of market norms and structures? All of those could be part of how you show up and the kinds of things you measure. Now, it might go without saying, but this is not always easy. It can be difficult. And just to set the stage around why it might be difficult, this comes from some of the work that all four of us, and particularly Matt and I, have been leading through the Reporting for Systemic Impacts mission at the Innovative Finance Initiative. With the group of practitioners there, we identified at least three buckets of challenges that often come up in this area. One is that when you're operating in complexity, you have to think and act in that context. This involves perhaps longer term time horizons, pathways that are not always linear, and distributed ways of looking at the world. These don't always lend themselves to the conventional impact measurement models and tools that we have at our disposal. Another set of challenges is around reporting. And as Matt will talk about, there is a mismatch sometimes between the annual cycles of reporting, the ways we think about what gets reported today, and maybe what else we need to be looking at when we think about these kinds of contexts. And then importantly, and this is what both Emily and Julia will talk about, who's your audience? How are you thinking about the different expectations they have? And what is this balancing act between getting precise, getting specific, getting clear when there might be a need to be more subtle, not acknowledge that maybe you don't have all the answers, but also try and think about the ways in which you're actually making progress or not. So there are some real tensions as we think about not only the audiences, for example, for reporting, but also the audiences you have internally and externally. And just in terms of what this looks like in practice, here's a set of ways to think about that. Often we see the conventional orientation try and talk about things in perhaps more precise, specific, and attributable ways. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. And if you're in this situation, you should keep doing some version of this. Increasingly, if you're applying more complexity and systems orientation to your work, you tend to use language and framing and positioning like on the right-hand side of this table. Regardless of where you sit, probably you're somewhere in the middle or want to be somewhere in the middle. You should ask the question around the dimensions that we have listed on the left-hand side. How are you thinking about what's the unit of analysis if you move from the enterprise or project or investment to something broader? What kinds of claims can you reasonably make, and what's your time horizon around how you can make those claims? How can you evolve your indicators and your KPIs in order to be able to accommodate both the specificity of direct impacts and maybe the diffusion that you'll have with some of the indirect or impacts around influence rather than direct effects? What are your assumptions around causality? How are you working, in and with others as part of collective impact initiatives or other things? Can you accommodate a longer term time horizon as part of both your operating horizon and your measurement horizon? And how might you need to rethink the kind of evidence that you're using or in fact valuing as you think about how to make those shifts? And we'll see maybe if we have time to talk about governance, because in many ways, this is at the heart of what changes. Because when you get into decision making, when you think about the ways in which today we look at how information is used within decision making, it shifts quite remarkably, and both in terms of how you look at the world as well as how you act. So, just to leave you with one of the resources that we've actually talked about in a previous webinar, and we'll send some links to this. One of the pieces of work that I've been working on last year around systems thinking for impact investing, we said that there are two things that shift when you bring these, particularly for IMM. One is that you have to be bringing in a mindset of more adaptability and learning. And you can do this by looking at a more continual learning orientation throughout the year, not just kind of working backwards from annual reporting. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that. You may have to embrace more experimentation. So you're trying different things and you have the ability to find a balancing act within your organizations around how you can prototype and unpack and validate some new ways of looking at the world, not just the conventional tools that are built really for a linear orientation. And to think about how you bring in more tools and approaches that are looking at your contribution, not just precise attribution, because sometimes that's very hard to do. Obviously, you can, but in terms of what's actionable and more useful, perhaps you need to shift some of that. And a second kind of set of work is really around rethinking what it is that you actually measure when you maybe you have a longer term time horizon, a different set of perspectives, etc. You might need to widen the set of things you look at. You might need to bring in new types of data, and you might need to construct new measures. And so that's what we're actually going to talk about in practice with our next set of slides. And I'm now going to hand it over to Emily to, while the session title here for this subsession is around indicators, it really draws on the broader work that Access has been doing as they've been shifting some of their perspectives as an organization across strategy, measurement, and kind of operations and field building in this context. But I've asked Emily to drill down a little bit more on KPIs just to give you some tangible examples. So Emily, over to you.
All right, thanks, Karim. And actually, although I'm going first in this, I would say the indicator is probably one of the last pieces of the puzzle. So you don't start here in practice. But maybe if we go on to the next slide, I just want to say a little bit about Access, the Foundation for Social Investment, where I sit on the board. Now, this is an England specific, not even UK, but England specific organisation set up to support charities and social enterprises here in England by making social investment more accessible. So the idea of providing loans or other non-grant finance to civil society. And primarily, Access was set up to do that as a wholesaler, so supporting social investment intermediaries or funds that then on-lend to the civil society. And we've been doing that for 10 years now. I've been involved on and off and now as a board member since the start. That was primarily through blended finance. So providing grant finance with repayable investment to make finance more affordable for these smaller organizations. But as we've reviewed our strategy and had a real strategy rethink over probably 2024, 2025, the board and the executive together, and this was involved by multiple partners as a legacy listening process, making sure that we were fully reviewing the strategy that we had using more of a systems lens, precisely because we have such an ecosystem mandate. As you can see there right at the top, Access wants to see an investment ecosystem that works for all charities and social enterprises, and that needs to outlive us. And that obviously goes way beyond us as a wholesaler providing capital. So it really forced us to go through both a systems mapping and stakeholder mapping as part of this legacy listening exercise as well over multiple months to iterate to a different strategy, which is now fully public. So if anyone wants to go into the detail, I'll include the link. And what's also public as part of that is the KPIs that I'm going to walk you through. So as we moved out of this thinking of the direct or indirect supply of blended finance to the social investment funds we're working with, we also realise that on the demand side, you need more support for charities, more cultural shift that's required around building their capacity and business models, diversifying their income beyond grants in some instances, but also market development, the third aspect here. So really looking at that supply of capital and what sort of funds are available and from where beyond the role that Access can provide that specifically targets those underserved communities and places in England. So there's really broadened out the framing. So I think that goes to, first of all, setting the boundaries before you even start to think about, well, what activities you're going to pursue and then what indicators you're going to use for that. And so if we go on to the next slide, you might think it's going to end up with a huge amount of KPIs. We came out with 5 KPIs. So you can go through that entire process, and it doesn't mean you need to start measuring exponentially more things. In fact, to some extent, the opposite was our experience. So I'm going to walk you through the first KPIs that we looked at, which is maybe the more bread and butter to us, the more basic KPIs, which was less of a shift from what we were doing before, which is very much about those capital flows. So really there, we wanted to focus on the investment flows that were going to charities and social enterprises, so dispersed through the intermediaries we're supporting, but also beyond. Because for us, if there's a thriving ecosystem, it's not just about what we're directly or indirectly supporting, but what's happening in the wider ecosystem. And also that proportionally more of that money is flowing to underserved communities. There's a clue in our name about Access. We want to make sure that it's representative of civil society in the UK and not just going to those who are most able to work out financing arrangements, but is it really flowing to all areas of England, to those that are led by people with particular characteristics, for example? So lots of different dimensions to that. But what changed in how we thought about that? There was a slight shift in the thinking that we had around how we think about the context of that. So we would look at the proportions about how we assess or track that over time, which has to be contextualized, as I mentioned. So one of the targets that we have, and this is under each of these, I'm going to show you one example. There are lots of extra quantitative and qualitative elements underneath these, what look like quite simple KPIs. And one of those targets is around maintaining the current gap that there is between the average access deal size that's supported and the average market deal size. The types of deals that access supports tend to be 1/10 of the size of the average deal size. And why is that important? It's an indicator proxy. It's not perfect, but it's a proxy to tell us that these loans are supporting typically smaller organizations. And there are only so many organizations that can take on social investment. We want to make sure it's more accessible. So things like that require us to look at what's happening in the wider market. And the average deal size, for example, is just one sub indicator, whilst also pegging what we're doing to make sure that that gap is not shifting too much and we're not moving up market, so to speak, and starting to provide bigger lending. So it's about contextualizing alongside what else is happening in the marketplace on an ongoing basis, so constantly calibrating that. And also say that around this flow of money, we've invested heavily in the data sources and providing that through Power BI, for example, and making that more transparent. So looking at the data sourcing to make sure that you can see on our website, for example, if you want to go and have a look at some of our Power BI dashboards that shows where and how that money is flowing. So we're sort of opening up that information to other stakeholders, both our partners, but anyone that wants to go and have a look at that. And that's about really encouraging that wider evidence base can be used, can be scrutinized, can form part of an ongoing dialogue with our partners about what's happening and what are we noticing, because we might have an interpretation of the data that we see, but we only have a partial picture. So we need to constantly calibrate that against what others are doing. So there was something about opening up that information, investing heavily in ensuring that data is more accessible and available to others to draw their own conclusions and form part of ongoing strategy. So already just a couple of points I think that highlights in terms of what's changed is that you don't need to collect all this data yourself. So this relies on, some of it will be collected through our partners, but others is about market sizing. It's about what other organizations are collecting, i.e. social investment market sizing data. And we have financially supported some of that as well. So there's a responsibility we feel to support that infrastructure in England. But that means that there's a greater base of information. We don't all have to collect it ourselves, which might duplicate efforts. But also, I think there's a greater power to that wider transparency of data that others can use. So that's also one shift. If we move on, click forward, please. The three other KPIs, I won't going to go into each of these in detail, moves more into, if you go back to that, think back to that 1, 2, 3 diagram I showed of the wider impact and the wider ecosystem effects we're thinking about. We're also really concerned with the resilience of the system, and that really starts to speak to indicators of system health. So moving beyond just kind of the linear capital flows that we're supporting, but starting to think about indicators of what resilience actually means and what that can look like, and then wider ecosystem behavior. So get back to that supplies of capital point. So if I go and dig in a little bit to KPI 4 about the social investors we work with on More Resilient, and I will say the link is the bottom, and you're going to get these slides so you can fully see every KPI and all the detail underneath those KPIs. And we also have a dashboard on the website that indicates progress against these that we update on an annual basis. So if you go on to the next slide, please. Just to dig into some of that quantitative and qualitative detail that sits under KPI 4, and some of it's work in progress. We also started out saying, look, this is the direction of travel, but we actually don't know at this point how we're going to do that. This is part of conversations with partners as well, which is being refined over time. But one of the other key things that shifted by taking this system lens in how we thought about resilience is we've always taken done lots of operational due diligence and thought about the balance sheet strength, and there'll be lots of financial measures that we'll take when we look at whether we're going to support a partner or not, a partner being a social investment fund. But is that really the true measure of resilience? It's a part of the picture, but is it a full picture of what resilience means? So we've done lots of research looking at different definitions of resilience, but really it started to be around, well, if we're not going to be here forever as a funder, and if we're trying to support the resilience of our partners, well, what does it mean to them to be resilient? So it became much more of conversation about individually looking at those partners, all very different, operating in different contexts, different parts of England, supporting different themes in some cases, topics that they're supporting, and really having discussions with them about what resilience meant to them. So rather than us having all those answers and saying, well, we decide as the funder, this was about a conversation about what does resilience mean and what would it mean for you as a social investment intermediary to be resilient, which requires a little bit of discomfort. It's much more hard to aggregate because they might have quite different views on that. but is also a key part of that system, meaning of, well, they're going to have to feel resilient if we're going to talk about resiliency system. And it's also informed how we think about that. So it's quite bespoke. There's a combination of those sort of fixed financial operational DD metrics, but also this quite bespoke feeling of what resilience means. And so that's also quite relational. And I think what you also see in characteristics of system health or systems thinking is often quite relationship oriented metrics and thinking about strength of partnerships and what power might be shifting as well. So these are all dimensions of the KPIs that you see underneath what might look like quite a simple KPI on the surface. So as I say, challenging and it's not aggregatable, but I think gives you a much richer understanding ultimately of what that shift might look like. So if we go on to the final slide, just some other learnings. I mean, we went through this process for each of the KPIs, as I say, it continues to be work in progress. But I think the first key learning for us as a board in going through this whole process was that, you know, the impact measurement and management part and these KPIs really become learning questions, and it's intrinsically linked to our strategy. The impact measurement and management that we've done to date as an organisation absolutely informed the change in Access's strategy, from focusing on access to finance to a broader perspective of access to markets is how we think about our work now. I think the second point that it's very much iterative. You can set a strategy for the next 3 years, which we've done, but it is very much a learning process, as I say, and it has to evolve. That measurement focus has really shifted from collecting lots of data on capital flows, and we did evaluations, to incorporating these wider signals of system health. And that, as you can see, is a mix of quantitative data, it's disaggregated data, it's blended data, but it's also quite qualitative and relationship oriented. And it does become less input, output, outcome, impact oriented in the way that many of us working in impact have been trained in. And that will feel uncomfortable. And I think that's okay. So I think something about embracing the discomfort that this can lead us to, because you do still need to balance that with accountability. And I saw there's lots of questions about contribution, attribution, which do have to be rethought in this context. And that can be a source of discomfort, but it also feels more honest. And that takes me to the last point. Access's CEO has used the framing of liberating to describe where we came out, because although it can be uncomfortable, it can also be liberating to be really honest about what you can control and what you can be accountable for. There are specific things that you can be and some things that you cannot be, and we don't have to measure everything ourselves. So a lot of what Access reflects on is actually more how we show up in those partnerships and in those relationships, and how that might influence, as I said, the power dynamics, which isn't easy as a funder, but ultimately we will be judged on the legacy and the resilience of social investment in England, not that X amount of pounds went to XYZ organisations. And so keeping that front of mind has been really critical in this whole process. Back to you, Graham.
Thanks, Emily. I think that was a really great overview. And Tennille has shared also some additional background from the webinar that we ran last year, which provided a bit more into the Access experience. Emily introduced a few new layers here around the choices, the kind of texture underneath each KPI, and also some of the implications. And I think that, this is all a balancing act in practice, and every organization will find its own version of how far to go, how precise to be, but also to ensure that measurement actually acts in service of your goals rather than, sometimes what it feels like is this kind of thing that you do after everything else you do. I think in this case, we can see in the way that Emily explained it too, that the act of doing it in this way also amplifies and strengthens partnerships. It is directly aligned with some of the broader mission. And it also means you have to make some choices around, as an organization, what you decide to focus on and how you might unpack some of the different kinds of data around what's actually going on in practice. So we'll get into some of these themes during our Q&A as well. Thank you, Emily. Matt, over to you next, and talk to us about reporting and maybe set the stage around how people maybe might think about reporting, let's say in conventional senses, and what we're beginning to learn around how this is shifting as we introduce a more complexity and systems-oriented perspective.
Great. Thanks, Karim, and hi, everyone. So I will say a few words about reporting, which I think is a topic that many, perhaps all of us in this webinar are very familiar with. And let's be honest, the experiences of reporting are often not great. It's something we often have to do, or think we have to do for funders, which is true. But I think more deeply, how we report, what we report, it really does send strong signals about what matters to us, to our funders, to peers, and to the wider public. So yes, on the one hand, reporting can definitely shape decisions about where capital flows, investment and allocation decisions. But on the other, I think it's useful to think about reporting as one of those few structured moments, particularly in the impact investing space and beyond, where we pause and try to make sense of what's actually happening. We try to surface assumptions, uncertainty, and to align both internally and externally on the way forward, which I think is really essential when we are trying to take a complexity-aware approach. So Karim said it earlier, I think there's a lot of ambition that's shifting at the moment towards taking a more systemic lens, but the tools and frameworks we rely on are still, by and large, very much built for that more linear world. And perhaps nowhere is that mismatch more apparent than in reporting and reporting expectations. And I do think that creates real challenges for how we capture and communicate what we're doing if and when we take a systems lens. Because in many ways, Karim mentioned it earlier, reporting is doubly difficult when you're looking at driving towards systems change. First, we've heard, the nature of the systemic work means that change is emergent, non-linear, long-term. It makes it actually really difficult to capture. But second, the reporting paradigms we operate within, and the ecosystem that most of us operate in, it doesn't allow us to sort of map a systems change lens, and particularly progress towards our systems change goals, neatly onto those more, let's say, traditional reporting structures that really do expect everything to be compressed into quarterly or annual reporting cycles, even though we all know that systems change only unfolds over decades. And perhaps, above all, audiences are used to reading confident assertions of, fairly well-evidenced progress. They expect simplicity and certainty in our descriptions of progress towards impact goals, which are pretty much by definition exactly the things that systems work cannot provide. So on the next slide, I'll just say a few words about an initiative we have been stewarding at Impact Frontiers, which is something called the Impact Performance Reporting Norms. The Impact Performance Reporting Norms start by asking a simple but important question. So who are you reporting to and why? And I think it's a fairly foundational and important question to start with, because reports often do serve multiple stakeholders, not just funders, but a variety of internal and external audiences, such as peers, wider public, governance bodies as well. And there's a lot of different motivations of why people would want to read and engage with information about impact performance that map onto that prove, improve, and learn spectrum that Karim mentioned earlier. Perhaps they want confidence that work is credible. They want evidence to help refine strategy, make course corrections, and ultimately, perhaps to build a shared understanding of what, to be honest, what a systems approach even is, what's working, what isn't, and what we're collectively learning. So it can all actually help build legitimacy for taking a systems lens and creating a license to operate systemically. So I think what we have to do if we're taking and holding the pen on writing an impact report and communicating our impact performance is to make deliberate choices based on the audience and their needs. So we have to make choices about what to communicate, and particularly how much of the complexity to bring forward to match the why of reporting. And those are not easy questions. But on the next slide, you can see a couple of sneak previews into what is emerging from the group that Karim mentioned earlier that we're working with through the Innovative Finance Initiative. And the aim here is not to abandon the IMM foundations and traditional ways that most of us are used to working with, but it's to build on them, to complement them with practices that are more explicitly systems informed, including those, and I saw a few of these mentioned in the chat, that really draw on adjacent disciplines that have been thinking about these questions for a long while, whether it's evaluative thinking or wider monitoring, evaluation, and learning practice. So I'm not going to go through all of these now, but on the screen you can see some of them. Things like really trying to refocus expectations, and it's not just about reporting as far along the outcome or impact pathway as possible towards outcomes, but actually it's about understanding the deeper shifts for lasting change. Things like clarifying the system and the boundaries we're drawing around it, both in terms of the scope of measurement and the level of ambition. And one of the things, if we move to the next slide, that's worth thinking about as well is that, inevitably, whatever choices we make, disclosing progress and communicating progress towards system change goals is going to come with more uncertainty. I think more gaps in understanding and quite often perhaps weaker or more indirect evidence. So I think the question here becomes, how do we report all this in a way that's still credible and useful? And again, here, a sneak preview of some of the thoughts coming out of this group, which are things like the importance of not only hyper-focusing on our intended positive effects, so the kind of the assumptions we're making around the theory of change, but being open about any negative or unintended effects as well, but also being really clear around, if you like, what we don't know, those known unknowns, recognizing that collectively we're much better at assessing system shifts that are related to things like policies and resource flows than we are at understanding maybe some of those deeper, more transformative changes, such as the power dynamics that was mentioned earlier, or even things like our underlying mental models. I don't think any of this is straightforward, and it's certainly going to be a journey. And kind of finding that balance is always going to be a judgment call about what to include in your reporting, what to leave out, and how to present it in the most credible but compelling way. So I'd like to end with this quote on screen, which is from, I'm sure many of you know the leading systems thinker, Donella Meadows, but it really resonates strongly, and it relates to the issue I mentioned earlier of systems boundaries. So there is no single legitimate boundary to draw around a system, but we have to invent boundaries for the sake of clarity and sanity. And I think that just underlies the fact that things like system boundaries aren't fixed truths. They're choices we make, and we draw things like boundaries to make sense of complexity. But I think being hyper aware that the choices we make determine, what we pay attention to, what gets included in the scope of measurement and assessment and reporting, and what we believe is possible. And I do think it's the same with reporting. So we know that whatever we end up putting into a report is always going to be a simplification of that messy reality of the real world. But I think if we're clear about who we're communicating to and why, and the choices we're making about what to include and how to present it, then we can hopefully make more informed judgment calls that don't just kind of unintended constrain our systems change work, but actually, even if we do it well, create more space for it, maybe bring others along on the journey too.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And I would just say, and maybe you can share the link to the performance reporting norms. This is a attempt to acknowledge the tensions that Matt described around when we're thinking about what this requires in terms of the work itself, and then how we communicate it. There'll be many things that we learn about how we do our systems work that we may not choose to share externally, but we may choose to share internally. Thinking about how we can be just open, transparent around not only the classic questions of are we doing things as planned, but really to ask the deeper questions of, are these the things we should be working on? How could we be working differently? And in what ways can we use our external communication along with our internal communication to amplify and kind of engage more deliberately in this collective agenda that I think a lot of systems work requires. And so it does really shift the frame around reporting as, a more narrow set of, whether we call it compliance or maybe, some sanitized kind of messages, to something a bit more of an invitation, whether it's around what you're learning, who you'd want to partner with, what else you think is needed, what's your distinctive role. All those become part of how you show up. And I think, though, as Matt was saying, that the work we've been doing recently is to acknowledge that there is this balancing act of trying to be clear, precise, specific as we would in normal, conventional reporting, but also recognizing we have ambition, it's messy, and there are things that may only be clear and more visible over multiple years rather than in any singular report. And that's okay to acknowledge, but also every organization has a different threshold around how they do that. So thank you, Matt. We'll move to Julia now, and Julia will pick up on some of the internal perspectives. We've talked quite a bit, and even in previous webinars around, with Acumen's experience at multiple levels of investments, constructing new products, and also looking at field building and really trying to shift some of the narratives. The bigger questions are not only how you show up externally, but what does this look like internally? So Julia, over to you to tell us a little bit more about how you see this and how you can encourage others to think about what it takes to do this well internally.
Thanks, Karim. Maybe I'll start with one of the things that comes up for me when I try to talk about systems, systemic investing or system change across impact measurement. It's quite common that after half a sentence, people start to withdraw because it's overwhelming, it's abstract, it's not easy to understand. And for me, that's where I get like a surge of energy, trying to make sure that, first of all, we keep it real. We connect it back to what is it that we do and what is our part and role in that system, to connect it back to also what can be interesting and fun. Because sometimes this work can get quite abstract, and then we forget the power of IMM to really shift the focus towards what we can change in the real world. And with that in mind, I thought I'd talk a little bit about how this shows up within Acumen, because I think we spoke about what is expected around system change and systemic investing. We talked about KPIs and how they can help focus. We talked about reporting. I think what's key is also how do you bring people along internally and who makes decisions at what moment. So at Acumen, we have a broad mission of solving problems of poverty, and we do that via multiple initiatives and funds. So if you think about the first step, actually, before you even go towards portfolios and strategies, is like, what does that mean in terms of Acumen's system? And who makes decisions there? So like what Emily says, we don't start with KPIs or reporting. You start with your strategy and refining that. And in fact, having a sense of KPIs gives that specificity that allows people to understand, okay, hang on, what are we really talking about? And this is where I think as an impact professional, we often dance between these layers and we become translators. So what does that mean for top leadership who wants to fundraise, speak to the world? And what do they need to decide in order for us as an organization to be more successful in our impact magnification on the ground? So the first step is really that strategy setting. And then that then translates into, well, if we operate globally as Acumen in various regions, we can't talk about a system as a localized one. And in fact, even the global ambition that we might have looks quite different compared to what we might establish at the portfolio level. So one of the things or metrics that you can think about in that way are our ambitions to influence capital flows, which Emily also highlighted. But for Acumen, what's also key is that we try to support social enterprises and entrepreneurs. How can we make their ability to do business better? So our focus is also on how can we create a better and supportive social enterprise ecosystem. And the other piece is really around how we and Acumen can support access to affordable and, for our new strategy, climate smart products and services. So what we have is a current example at Acumen where we're shaping our new strategy, focusing on the intersection between climate and poverty. We have those as a couple of overarching principles and ambitions. But then when it really comes to life is then, okay, well, what does that look like in terms of our investment portfolios and theses? And here we break it down into our what we call sort of sectors or pillars. So that will include sectors like energy and agriculture. So that's when you go down this layer of the portfolio, like who then decides that? So that's where you shape your strategy, you refine your theory of change. And that's where also you need to start thinking about how do we show up here? If we think with that broader mandate in mind, how can we make life easier for social enterprises? It's not just about our little capital injection. It's that wider that wider ambition of making the companies and the leaders grow in their ability to help solve the problems of poverty, to grow the companies, and also to ensure them to leverage more capital. I think then to go down to each deal, you need to make the deal by deal decision. And this is where that's, to be honest, the real deal, literally. So if you want to get your investment teams to understand what this looks like, you can use IMM and tools and frameworks, scoring, or initial checklists to help guide that initial alignment with the overall strategy, your investment strategy, and then what should good look like on a deal by deal basis. But also, how do we show up in the world beyond our investment work? We already spoke about power. If you're on the side of money, you hold power. How do you also allow for sharing of networks, of convenings? And this is where I think what I try to do at Acumen for myself, but also support the rest of the team to do, is to do system acting. Go beyond your checkbox and your deal. How do you show up and how can you leverage your respect, your power and humility in this work? So go to the next slide. If you think about bringing along all these decision makers, one of the things that a systemic lens allows you to do is to take into account multiple dimensions. And here I've highlighted three ways in which this shows up. The first one is you need to take into account different perspectives. So this is where you can have a global mandate or an investment strategy, but ultimately you're trying to ensure that this work makes sense on the ground. So how do we take into account local needs? How does that show up in these sector strategies and how does that layer up to the global priorities? So our work at Acumen actually starts with that, and it requires some framing and judgment rather than sort of KPI or data. So these perspectives are all taken into account, but that also shows up in how we use data. What kind of information and evidence will you look at? And this is where we work with customer surveys using 60 decibels. So we actually bring in the voice of the ultimate users, including farmers and customers. Of course, our main sphere of control and influence is the company, our investees. So we take into account the information from them. And we have to take into account this broader sets of information. And this is where you have to work with research and evidence that you can integrate into your thinking. The good thing here is that you can work with systems and tech. So it's not about a one person doing all of this. And in fact, that brings me to the last set of dimensions here is how we can think about IMM skills that are actually a combination of strategic thinking and prioritization in terms of what's most important and translating that to the relevant decision makers from the previous slide. But also that curiosity, the research, the asking the right questions and what counts as evidence. And that goes beyond data collection from a monitoring cycle or even goes beyond reporting. And in fact, this is what we often do is a lot of our most important information for learning and strategies is from dedicated research projects that go alongside our monitoring and alongside our customer data. So we triangulate the data, but we're also quite mindful that you can't just monitor a system change in the way you do your annual monitoring with company data. So there's some choices that you make here. And that requires analysis, strategic prioritization, and negotiation, also for budgets. I noticed there was a question around who's paying for all of this, especially in the current climate. It's not a given. And it's also not just an academic paper exercise. It's really about how do you understand and how do you build in dialogue from your data, as opposed to think, okay, well, we get the data and it's crunched and then you have a nice diagram. At the same time, this is where I get very excited because ultimately it comes back to people and it comes back to incentives as well. And for me, what helps is to keep it real and keep it fun in order to not just keep the sanity, as Matt highlighted, but also to allow for the discussion of what really matters and using that as an alignment and as a continuation of a North Star that not only allows you to communicate, but also act in the best way you can, given all the noise and the mess around us.
Great. Thank you, Julia. And I think this slide is pretty powerful, and I encourage everyone to reflect this back in your own organization or even your own personal context. What are the ways in which you're embedding these multidimensional perspectives? As Julia mentioned, they can span from, how you look at the kind of regional perspectives, like global to local. They can span how you look at the issues across different sectors. Often there's intersectionality between different issues. I think also at Acumen, you've been quite deliberate about this. And sometimes this shows up at the intersection of things like climate and gender, but sometimes it is deliberately, intersectional when we think about concepts like resilience, which again, I know you've done some work in. Thinking about how you unpack this multi-dimensional data. And again, as Julia said, those happen both at different levels, individuals, companies, different parts of the ecosystem, but also can change over time. And sometimes you want point-in-time data versus data that you're looking at over time and trying to look at what are the patterns underneath that and what's it telling you about also who you're including and who you may not be. That's where the research lens also becomes particularly important. And then finally, reflect yourself as someone who's doing this work. This is one of the questions that we pick up on in the program, but I think all of us grapple with is, we've all been trained in certain ways to look at the world. If you've been trained in finance, economics, sometimes, those models are built for linear worlds and are seeking precision and reducing uncertainty. If you've been trained in sociology or anthropology, you're looking at it in a very different lens. And again, each of us maybe have this distinctive combination. Think about what version of that shows up for yourself and in your teams, and how you can build this out in a way that allows for the kind of variation that this work requires. I'm going to pick up on just a few themes and questions, and please share some of them. We have a little bit of time. Maybe I'll just pose a couple of questions initially to each of our speakers, and then feel free to share those. Emily, I wanted to ask, you have the vantage point of a board member, you've done some of this work with other organizations. What have you learned about doing this kind of work in practice? When you look across multiple asset classes, different kinds of measurement, I guess, yeah, both what have you learned? Maybe what have you had to unlearn when you do this kind of work?
Oh, that's a very big question. But I was just actually trying to type, so I'll just say just some of the comments in the chat around, I've given you an example there, which is a very boundaried context of access of social investment in England, quite specific. But there are lots of examples, and I was just referring to Monique's comments there from TIP's work, for example, the Investment Integration Project for institutional investors, which may be a very different context, completely different scale, very challenging to boundary because, many of those will be globally diversified, got huge exposure through their investments. And yet you can still use the systems lens, and there's lots of fantastic examples from TIP's work, and this is some of the stuff I was doing when I was wearing another hat at Fidelity International, of incorporating systems thinking into quite listed equities portfolios. Are very, very different, but you can think about how you tie measurement approaches to these kind of characteristics of system health. And actually that's something that institutional investors do think about very readily, is characteristics of system health, because they're constantly looking at market indicators, macro context, lots and lots and lots of data available in public markets, for example. So it's a completely different context, but actually there is a bit of a read across in some of the discipline and the thinking. And the read across, I think, is quite cultural to your question, Karim. So where this works and where this, for it to work well, is it does require a cultural openness to that reflection and that discomfort about the ambiguity that I mentioned. And I think that's where you can come up with a tension with quite traditional impact measurement approaches that I mentioned before, of input, output, outcome, and sometimes can be a false pretense of what we think we're doing and what we think we're achieving, as has been some of the criticisms of this space. So that's why I made that point around it can be quite liberating in a while. I mean, I see the point also about the hubris and the concerns about, you start talking systems and people think, who are we playing God here? But actually, if you can recognize those boundaries, but recognize the distinction between your intent and your inputs and then what might happen, there might be quite a big gap between those things. It can actually be quite liberating, sort of counterintuitively. And I think one of the key things that I didn't mention around access was so much that enabled this shift in these discussions that happened over the last few years was a culture of learning, which isn't easy to get to or easy to achieve, but is where a lot of the work needs to happen. So there was that need for accountability to stakeholders, but there also needed to be an honesty and a reflection on what we maybe weren't doing so well or what we didn't know, which required quite a lot of work within the organisation as well, to shift any kind of incentives or perceived incentives, even, or framing of this is about proving to this is about improving and learning. And you have to shift how you operate as a team to do that and to enable that. And that's something that we went through to some extent at Fidelity as well. And for those who are interested, there's a forthcoming book called The Handbook of System Level Investing coming out this spring. And there's a bunch of chapters in there of really practical examples about institutional investors who've come across some of this work or grappled with some of this work. And I contributed a chapter on that about measurement and how we thought about that in a public markets context that might be of interest to people.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. And yeah, there's a great exchange on many of the themes you've touched on and responded to. I can see Alexander, Sarah, Monique, Alan. These are very real tensions, and I think the issues around boundaries and both the consequences of how we might, draw boundaries. I think Matt, you captured this really well, both with the quote, but also we've been feeling this in our recent discussions around do you draw boundaries in order to then just have better analysis? How often do you shift the way that you show up? What are the ways in which our analytical tools today are built to do this well in a way that allows us to improve? So maybe I'll ask you to respond particularly to these questions, Matt, around the intersection of, boundary setting, our tools and approaches, how we think about not only what we influence, but then also how we report and communicate. What have you shifted, I guess, in your own thinking or unlearned as you look at this intersection of issues?
Yeah, so many interesting questions in the chat. And building on that, Karim, I think there's a couple of things. One is when we're thinking about causality, both in terms of intentionality and claims, really to think around maybe it's less about proving what slice can we claim and attribute to ourselves versus what can we learn about whether what we're doing is working or not, and more importantly, who gets to decide what's working or not, and that triple loop learning question. I think the second is that this is a big tent. There's lots of different mindsets and ways of approaching systems change. I think we need to apply that mental model thinking to ourselves as well. What are we coming at it from? Is it a kind of an emergence point of view where we're trying a bunch of things and seeing what's working? Or is it a view that's actually more around system dynamics? We're trying to find a leverage point and we're trying to kind of try one thing and pivot and build on what we've initially tried. So I think those two things, just questioning our own mental models, not throwing the contribution out, but reframing how we approach it, I think are interesting ways forward.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And Julia, any initial or reflections, I think, just based on this exchange and to what you built on around when you look internally and acknowledging the tensions and the multidimensionality, what have you learned about what this looks like in practice? What have you had to unlearn? I know we had an exchange over the last year in particular around this balancing act of really, in some parts of our work, we want to be more precise, we want to be bounded, we have to be specific, and we have to use some of the conventional methods. In other cases, we have to acknowledge that we can reframe, we can rethink, and there is space and time and resourcing to do that. But it's not always the case that can coexist. So maybe any other reflections based on what you've seen in the chat and from your experience?
Yeah, maybe just quickly. I like always to find hooks. When is the right moment to consider this? And I think, of course, while we're currently shaping our strategy, that's a good window where you can have that strategic conversation. We're also closing off some initiatives that we're now closing out. Again, those are good moments. If you're starting a new fund, or if you're starting your deployment in year 1 or 2, those are not the moments where people's minds are open to reshape what the thinking should be. So there's something about how to find the hooks and and bring people along. And I think it's not about shifting everything, but it is about having the right conversations and keep bringing back that translation to what's the North Star, but then what does it mean for us right now? And I think for me, using the hooks and the timing has been quite helpful, because you can get stuck talking with only a few people about this if you don't leverage the right moments and the right people.
Thanks, Julia. And I know we've got some great questions. Iranis just shared one, which I think was really good, of what have you had to let go of, the most difficult trade-off you'd had to make. I think for me, and maybe I'll ask everyone to respond quickly before we wrap up. I think it is that, if you've been trained in being precise, specific, you have a good toolkit of technical tools, and all of a sudden, you are forced to rethink, where did those tools come from and what were they built to do? And is that the thing we are actually doing? We talk a lot about this at the beginning of the program too, around how did the paradigms that we use come to be? What was behind them and what were they optimizing for? And again, and maybe in different eras, those tools and frames were entirely appropriate. Right now, we are questioning a lot of them, right? Like, what does the choice of a certain set of perspectives tell you about your alignment with, let's say, if you need to shift power? What does it look like if your tool is built for bounding and reducing that kind of complexity, when in fact you're acknowledging that there may be more complexity, particularly in the times we live in? And so that tension and unlearning that, or certainly having a little bit more comfort, I think has been the most toughest part for me. Emily, what about you before we wrap up?
Yeah, I've answered, so I put it in the
Okay.
answer. But I think that's part of the unlearning to your earlier question, which is hard for us impact professionals.
Great. Matt, what would you say?
Oh my goodness. I think in general, it's that language matters. Not necessarily have to unlearn, but to actually that the words we use can be interpreted extremely differently by different audiences. And when we start to think about systems, we actually start to communicate kind of beyond our bubbles. And it behoves us not to just understand what we mean by the words, but how they could be interpreted for others. And you don't want to get hung up on definitions and semantics, but it's super important both for progressing our work, but also kind of building that legitimacy buy-in around the work that we do with this.
Right. Thanks, Matt. Julia, last word.
Last word. I think there's something about, in order to clean up the communication, you do need to go through the work. You need to go through the thinking in order to clean it up and present it. And that going through it is quite uncomfortable because it's a lot of pieces. So I think what I had to maybe unlearn is expect that you can be crisp straight away. And at the same time, the second thing to learn is not to stay lost in trying to be comprehensive, because it's all a construct. A market is a construct, a system is a construct. So you can't fix it or solve it because it's where you put the lines. So also not staying too long in it and just moving forward. So working through it, but not too long would be my takeaways.
I think that is a great way to end, and I fully resonate with that. Thank you, everybody. I know we ran over time, but we just wanted to share very quickly a couple of things that, if all this felt really complex to you and you think like, just tell me what to do, here are 3 things you can do, because sometimes this is what people need. Look at your KPIs, think about the different levels at which they're actually constructed today and how you can, again, as we've all maybe hinted at, unpack those to look at the different levels of change that incorporate what you most have control or influence under most directly versus the more broader systems-oriented work. And there are examples from all 3 of our speakers, and particularly, from Axis and Acumen, that you can look at. Try and add one system-oriented indicator to your work today. It could be around ecosystem health, around policy or market dynamics, or around power and inclusion. Just see where you can go with it. It could be qualitative, it could be quantitative. Often it is some kind of mixed methods approach that you need to collect this kind of information. and then test one new way of collecting data about the system. You may talk to new people that you don't talk to today, around what is shifting as a result of our work and the work of others in this area. Think about what are the multiple kind of ripple effects of the work that you and others are doing, and think about the different approaches like most significant change, storytelling, and many others that are built for these kinds of settings and these kinds of issues. To close this out, get in touch if you're interested in our program. Our colleagues, Tennille and Christine, are here to help you with any questions. They can also provide follow-up information. We'll send a recording of this, I believe, next week. We'll share the slides and we'll share some links, including the webinars from last year that provide a bit more around this topic. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure just being part of this conversation. I want to thank also Julia, Matt, and Emily for your contributions. It's been great being on this journey with you. And to all of you, please stay in touch, and we look forward to hearing from you in our future webinars.
Thanks, Kareem. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.